Here we go. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You are looking live at the third episode of the Jacksonian, as I have with me Jake Hatch from Locked On Cougars and KSL Sports Zone, and he's also a writer of Football Writers Association of America. Did I get that right?
Yeah, member of the FWAA. You got it. Nailed it.
Thank you, man. It's an awesome association. And tonight we're going to be going over the take on BYU joining the Big 12, where they stand in the preseason, amongst other topics on tonight's show. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm doing great, frankly. Jackson, thanks for having me on. It's good to be on with you and talk some BYU football.
Absolutely. Would you like to tell the audience about yourself for a little bit?
Sure. Of course, I host a BYU-centric podcast. It's called the Locked On Cougars podcast. It's a daily, we call them bite-sized podcasts, 20 to 30 minutes, getting you up to speed on everything going on in BYU sports on a daily basis. My day job, I do sports radio in Salt Lake City, as you already mentioned, for the KSL Sports Zone. I'm the executive producer of the station, so have a lot of fun with that, obviously, talking all things sports, BYU, Utah Jazz, NFL, you get the whole gamut. So I love doing that. I've been doing that for nearly 14 years now, and living the dream, frankly. It's a ton of fun. I've got a wife and 2 kids with a third on the way, so keeps me plenty busy. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, man, you got a third kid on. Congratulations, man. That's so awesome.
Appreciate that.
Oh, man. I am so excited about this show. So, first question I wanted to go over is, on July 1st, as of last week, BYU has officially become a member of the Big 12. How does it feel?
I think I speak for all of the BYU fans out there. They're just absolutely ecstatic is I think the term I've been using mostly. And it's something that BYU's aspired to be the Power 5 level for years now. They went independent with the whole goal of getting to this point. So 12 years as an independent football program, playing all over the country and a myriad of different opponents during that time. I think somebody did the math the other day. I think it was 64 unique opponents during those 12 years that they played across those 12 seasons. But the Cougars are super excited to be members of the Big 12 Conference, and they're ready to get going again. They spent so long in other conferences, the WAC, the Mountain West, etc. So they're excited to be back in a conference race and obviously be playing with that Power 5 label next to their name.
Oh, man, that's going to be so cool, man. It's going to be awesome. And so I want to go over, like, the pros and cons for a little bit of, like, the Big 12 right now. But also I want to go over what the pros and cons were of being an independent from 2011 to 2022. What were the pros and cons exactly on being an independent?
One of the pros for BYU, we'll start there, was the fact that they controlled themselves. Think about back to that. I always kind of point to the 2020 season. The pandemic obviously disrupted a lot of things. A number of conferences at first, like the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, were like, well, we're not going to play football this fall. BYU was able to decide for themselves, we're going to play football, and we're going to put together a schedule of whoever will play us. And so they played all over the country. They took that famous Coastal Carolina game on 3 days' notice to play in that one. And so that was one thing. It allowed BYU to operate independent, to use that term, of anybody. They were able to control what they could control, and that was themselves. And they had the national exposure that they had craved so highly during their latter stages of Mountain West, when they weren't getting that type of exposure with that contract they had with ESPN. And they obviously played all over the country. As I mentioned, I think it was 64 unique opponents during those 12 seasons, and literally played in every corner of the country: Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Northwest, Central America. They played the Midwest. They played everywhere. And that's the thing about it, is they also proved that BYU fans, they traveled in droves wherever the Cougars played. They would play at Georgia Southern, for example. They played a game down there. And I remember hearing from Georgia Southern fans, holy cow, BYU fans, are these all from Utah? No, there are BYU fans living down there near you guys near Georgia Southern, who just happened to wander on in to watch their Cougars play. It's a fan base that is truly nationwide, if not global. And that was one of the big pros for BYU and independence. Now, the cons. Obviously, with you getting to 6 wins, essentially you're locked into whatever bowl game you happen to be contracted to. It didn't matter if you went 6-6 or 10-2. It felt like in many circumstances for BYU, you play at whatever bowl game you were assigned by ESPN. A lot of them were lower tier bowl games. That's one thing BYU fans have craved for a long time that will obviously change in the Big 12, is having higher profile bowl games potentially available to them. Other con was the fact that you, in many ways, you didn't have a conference race to be a part of. So if you struggled out of the gate, you obviously some interest would fall by the wayside. There were points during independence when BYU would have attendance during the latter stages of a season that would dip into the 40,000s. Now, I understand the 40,000 for certain programs is a number of attendees for a game, but this is a program that is routinely used to having its stadium, Lavelle Edwards Stadium, that holds 63,000 plus fans, filled to the brim. So when they started seeing those just 40,000, and I had a person tell me there was one crowd in one particular game where they announced 40,000. They said that if there were more than 25,000 in attendance, they would actual butts and seats. They would have been surprised. So that was one of the big cons, is the lack of interest at times for BYU during independence. I think a lot of that goes by the wayside now because you are a part of a conference, and even if you're not necessarily having the season that you dreamed of, you can still play spoiler. And that's the thing about this. You pay attention to the scoreboard far more as a member of a conference, looking at how other teams around you in the standings are doing versus in independence. You're like, okay, we're playing, I don't know, Mississippi State this week in a one-off. It didn't really necessarily matter. It didn't have the same cachet that it did as it will as BYU's been in the Big 12. So it's a big, long answer to a simple question, but those are some of the pros and cons of independence for the Cougars.
Well, I'll say this on the note about BYU Coastal Carolina. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm a Bama fan, honestly, I watched that BYU Coastal Carolina game more than I did Bama LSU that night because I was like,
okay,
I'm interested in this. I mean, this is a battle right there.
Well, and that's the thing about it is both of those programs were playing. It was a game that they both needed for the national cachet they were trying to get. BYU was on the outside looking in with regards to potential New Year's Six bowl opportunities. And had they won that game, I don't know if it necessarily comes to fruition, but if you win that, you're still in the race for that. They lose that game. They come up a yard short as Dax Milne got tackled down on the 1 yard line. But that's the thing about it is it allowed BYU to do what they wanted to do in independence. They wanted to get exposure. They wanted to obviously be playing in front of their fans across the country. But I think as things wore on in independence, it came really clear that, hey, if we ever get the opportunity to jump into the Power Five, we're taking the drop of a hat. And that finally happened in 2021.
Well, I'm excited to see BYU in their first season of the Big 12, but I want to go over like what the pros and cons are. Like, I'm sure that you'll agree that the pro is they get to compete for a conference title, but the con is they basically had to cut off a lot of their non-con games.
Well, sure, and that's a big part of this. Is I wonder how BYU's philosophy with their non-conference schedule is going to change now as a member of the Power Five. For so many years, they play what I like to call a Power Five adjacent schedule. There was a couple years ago where they played 7 Power Five opponents. They've played routinely 5 and 6 Power Five opponents over the past 5 or so years in independence, and it was all with a goal to obviously be able to appeal to their fans. But a majority of those games were on the road. They very few and far between got those opponents on their home turf at Lavelle Edwards Stadium. That was a big issue for BYU fans. They wanted to see bigger name programs coming to Provo to play in those games. And that's the interesting part about this is now, they're going to have Oklahoma in Provo in late October this year. Late November, excuse me. And they're super excited for stuff like that. And that's the change now is you are going to have some familiarity with the opponents you play in your conference. But at the same time, to your point, you only have 3 non-conference games. How are you going to use those? This year, they're going to play Sam Houston State, Southern Utah, and Arkansas. I don't think that's necessarily an awful non-conference slate, but at the same time, I'm not going to lie that Sam Houston and Southern Utah barely moved the needle for me personally.
Well, to your point about BYU's non-conference schedule this year, I remember in like May 2022, and I was looking on FBS schedules, and for once, it wasn't BYU that did the canceling. It was Tennessee that did it because I'm like, I guess they don't want a repeat of 2019. I'm like, they don't want to go down to Provo. That's why they replaced them with Virginia.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing about that. I actually went to that Tennessee game in 2019. I was there in Neyland, and it was a fun environment, a crazy game, obviously. Huge win for BYU. But yeah, Tennessee decided to buy their way out of that game. They're going to play Virginia, I think, in Nashville. They're going to play where the Tennessee Titans play. And it cost them $2 million to buy out of that game. And I know BYU fans were ecstatic, thinking that Tennessee might be the home opener for BYU to start the 2023 season. But that's going to kind of be the concern now is, can you get non-conference games against, let's say, a Pac-12, an ACC, a Big Ten, or an SEC team, and get them to come play you in Provo? That's still a question that remains to be answered as BYU jumps into the Power 5 ranks.
Oh, man, that's going to be amazing. And to your point about Texas and Oklahoma, I looked at all the Big 12 schedules for this year. BYU is one of the 4 Big 12 teams to have Texas and Oklahoma in the 2023 Big 12 schedule. The other 3 are Iowa State, TCU, and Kansas. What's your take on that? Do you think, can BYU beat Texas and Oklahoma in the same year?
Can they? Yes. Will they? I don't think so. I actually think that they lose to Texas in Austin. Funny enough, I don't know how many people know this. BYU is, I think, the only program in the Big 12 currently that has winning records against both Texas and Oklahoma all time. BYU is 4-1 all time against Texas. They are 2-0 versus Oklahoma all time. So very small sample size, but could they win both of those? Yes, they could. I just think they split them. I think they lose to Texas in Austin. Obviously, Texas was just picked to win the Big 12, but I do think that Oklahoma comes to Provo. I do think BYU gets an upset on their home turf over the Sooners. But the thing about this is I think that BYU got both of those opponents because the schedule makers and the ESPN/Fox executives know that BYU Texas is going to draw eyeballs from Longhorn and Cougar fans from across the country, and they want those eyeballs on those games. So I think BYU, just because of their national cachet as a program, got the lucky bounce, if you will, to have both Texas and Oklahoma on their slate.
So I watched one of your episodes. It was the latest one on Locked On Cougars, and you talked about the all Big 12 team.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you talked about how Kingsley Sumatia is the only one on the Big 12 all Big 12 team, and you talked about how the other 3 that you voted for personally were Mason Wake, Ryan Rico, and Aiden Robbins.
Yep.
What was your reaction to when the all Big 12 media team decided we're not going to have these 3 guys on our all preseason team?
I wasn't all that surprised, honestly. I took a flyer in the case of like Mason Wake, for example. They have a fullback on that, and fullbacks are few and far between in college football, as you well know, Jackson. They're an endangered species out there. And Ben Sinnott got the nod from Kansas State, and I wasn't surprised that he got it, but he doesn't necessarily play a true fullback role in my mind, and that's what Mason Wake does for BYU. So that's why I picked him. Ryan Rico, I just feel like he is criminally underrated as a punter, so I threw him in as the punter. But I do think in the case of Aiden Robbins, he is a transfer to BYU by way of UNLV. He actually started out at Louisville, where he actually grew up. He's a Louisville native, but he ran for 1,000 yards a year ago for the UNLV Rebels down there in the Mountain West Conference. And BYU actually recruited this kid all the way back when he was in high school and picked Louisville ultimately in the end of his recruiting process coming out of high school. They're super excited to have him in Provo finally. He's a big body. He's all a 6'3", 230 pounds, if not heavier than that, but he's got really light feet. So I think if BYU hopes to have success this year, Aiden Robbins has got to have a pretty good year. And if he has the type of year that helps BYU get to a bowl, etc., I think that he very well could find himself, as I put him, as the newcomer of the year for the Big 12.
So I looked at the preseason poll today on Twitter, and the Big 12 has BYU at 11th, and the Lindy's magazine that I got in my lap that I got a few weeks ago, and it says that BYU is going to be 10th in the Big 12. Is it accurate? Is it too high? Is it too low? Is it What's your reaction?
Well, I'm lucky enough I get a vote on all this. So I did get a chance to cast my ballot, and I actually pegged BYU 10th myself. I think that BYU is in a pretty good spot, all things considered, going into the Big 12, but this is a defense in particular for BYU that is very much in flux. They fired their entire defensive staff after last season, after some horrific performances. Honestly, they had a game against Arkansas in Provo. The Razorbacks, Jackson, get this, scored on 8 straight possessions against BYU in that game. It was horrific. The defense gave up in that game, and the coaching staff, Kalani Sitake, BYU's head coach, I think realized at that point, you know what, I got to make a change. And he made the change at the end of the year, obviously letting go of his longtime friend, Elisa Tuiaki, who was his defensive coordinator. He brings in a guy that he knows well from his time at Utah and just having grown up in the coaching ranks together, in Jay Hill, the former head coach of Weber State here in Utah at the FCS level, led Weber State to multiple FCS playoff appearances. And he's come in, he's got to retool this defense. He's had a spring camp to start implementing it. Is it going to be completely exactly what he wants it to be year one now as BYU enters the Big 12? No. And the thing about it is the level of competition goes up significantly for the Cougars, as we all know, jumping into the Power 5 ranks. So I think sitting in that 10, 11, 12 range, I thought that was where BYU was going to land. It gives them obviously an underdog mentality, because I'm sure every player and coach looked at that and said, okay, they don't believe in us. And it gives you that chip on your shoulder to go out and shock the world. And we'll see what happens. I had one member, I'll say this, I had one member of the BYU staff I was in contact with yesterday, talking just a little bit about where they thought they ultimately might land. They told me this: I hope we're picked dead last. That was the statement I got from them. They want to be 14th because they want nothing more than to have guys who are hungry and go out there and really show the Big 12 what they're made of.
There we go. That's the spirit. There we go. So what impact is BYU joining the Big 12 going to have on the rivalry with Utah? Like, I know it's still on the schedule, but are we going to see like a rise that Utah has had in the Pac-12 in the future for BYU in the Big 12? Because I'm honestly feeling like we could see something like that.
Well, I think that the Cougars hope they can do something like that, because obviously Utah's been one of the top teams, if not the top team in the Pac-12 for the better part of 4 or 5 years. Obviously, back-to-back Pac-12 championships the last 2 years alone. Obviously, that's taken them some time. They've been in that Pac-12 for 12 years, so it took a good 5 or so years to really become a force in the conference, and they've just kind of steadily built themselves into being one of the elite teams in the Pac-12. Kalani Sitake, Jay Hill, who I already mentioned, the defensive coordinator, as well as Aaron Roderick, BYU's offensive coordinator, all three of them were on Kyle Whittingham's staff at Utah when Utah went from the Mountain West Conference to the Pac-12. They've experienced what it takes to build a program that makes the transition from a non-Power 5 to being a Power 5 program. And I think they understand it. You know what? It's not going to be – Rome wasn't built in a day. We use that phrase all the time. BYU's not going to go out year one, I don't think, here in the Big 12 and win 9 games and be challenging for a Big 12 title. I think that they get to 6-6 and start off with a bowl game in their first year in the Big 12. That's pretty good success in my mind. I think you just have to start building steadily for BYU. This is a program that's always going to have natural recruiting disadvantages because of the honor code that they make all student athletes live by. You also have academic restrictions that BYU's, the main university, requires of their student athletes as well. So there are things BYU's going to have to overcome as a member of the Power 5 conference, but the coaching staff is all in on this, and they want nothing more than to be able to go out and show that, hey, yes, we are BYU. We're probably thought of a little bit lightly by certain people, but we still want to go out and prove that we can play at this level.
To your earlier point about the defense being a disaster last year, I'm looking at the rankings, and the scoring was 96 in the nation. Mm-hmm. The rushing yards allowed per game were 97th in the nation. The passing yards allowed per game were 81st in the nation, and the total yards per game allowed were 93rd in the nation.
Yeah.
And BYU's defense go up to, like, say, the top 40.
Well, that's what they'd like to get, yes. And that they were that just as recently as 2 years ago. That's the thing about this. It's been a pretty precipitous fall for BYU from what was a decent defense to just being horrendous. Because you're right, those numbers, to be ranked in the 90s nationally, that's not good enough. Now, Jay Hill is a defensive mastermind. He did so many good things with his defenses at Weber State. He's actually brought over 2 of his cornerbacks in the defensive secondary with him to BYU. They went out and grabbed 2 transfers from Boise State. They grabbed Utah State's leading tackler at linebacker to come in and retooled this defense. There are pieces for BYU's defense I really like. I like two of their linebackers in Ben Bywater and Max Tooley. I think both of them are very talented players. But the bigger issue was there was just not a cohesive ability as a defense to get on the same page, it felt like at times last year. And that absolutely crippled them. So the biggest thing I think for Jay Hill this year with this defense is to get them to work together as a unit. Are they going to have moments where they break down? Yes, that's absolutely going to happen because they're still getting used to running a brand new defense. And obviously it takes some time to adjust to it. But I think the bigger thing is just having some self-belief in themselves. They were beaten down last year, that defense. I can tell you, having had conversations with multiple guys on that defense towards the end of the year, you could tell that they were just down on their luck. And it was just hard for them to do much of anything. It felt like positive. So the bigger thing is, I think if he can get them to believe, I think they can easily get themselves probably around to, I think that, I guess a good goal for me, speaking of the defensive metrics, is maybe get inside the top 60 this year. You anything beyond that, I think it'd be pretty good. And you continue to build and you maybe get back to top 40, 2 or 3 years down the road. And then at that point, with how good BYU's offenses have been of late, you'd have a team that I think can really make some noise in the Big 12, but it may take a little while.
So I'm looking at like the quarterback edition in Kedon Slovis. What was your reaction when BYU got him from the transfer portal?
Well, frankly, I was like, Kedon Slovis, really? Him? Like, why do they want him? But what I have heard, and just based on conversations with people in and around the program, is that they believe they can get what Kedon Slovis showed early on at USC out of him versus what he had shown in the latter stages of his time with the Trojans, as well as the 1 year at Pitt. They think he can return to more of the form he showed when he was that dark horse Heisman Trophy candidate in 2019 going into that season. They think they can get that out of him. Will they get that out of him? That's still a great question. But he showed very nice tools during a spring camp, showed an ability to attack the field from all angles with his arm. He's got a really, really nice deep ball, delivers it accurately down the field. And that's something that Aaron Roderick, BYU's offensive coordinator, absolutely loves. He loves going deep. He loves taking those shots down the field. And he requires it of his quarterbacks to be able to make those throws accurately. And if you look at Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall, the last 3 seasons, I should say, for BYU, you look at that offense, yeah, they'll dink and dunk at times, but then ever so often they will uncork a deep one on you. You got to be ready for it as the opposing defense. And that's one thing that Kedon Slovis brings, is the ability to really attack you with the deep ball. Is he going to be a guy that I think is going to light the world on fire? I don't think so. But if they can get any semblance of what he showed early on during his time at USC out of him, that'd be a pretty good quarterback. And I think it'd be a pretty good year for BYU in terms of quarterback play year 1 in the Big 12.
At one point, I remember watching BYU go up against USC in 2019. It was in Provo on ABC, and Kedon Slovis was quarterback there at that time.
Oh.
And I think you had like a backstory about this game. Like,
So, the funny thing is, he was the quarterback when they came to Provo. He actually ended up throwing a game-sealing interception in overtime that was picked off to lose the game. There was a 30-27 win for BYU. That actually came just exactly a week after they'd gone to Tennessee and won that game in double overtime. So, pretty thrilling back-to-back weeks there in 2019. Zach Wilson was the quarterback for BYU in both those games, and it's kind of the early days of his tenure as BYU's quarterback. But Kedon Slovis, after the fact, and this goes, I think, a year after the fact, he went on a podcast. I want to say it was like a West Virginia podcast or something like that, where he talked about the fact that BYU fans were the most sober, mean crowd he had ever experienced in his entire life. And we actually had some fun with him when he first got his opportunity to talk to the media in spring camp out here in Provo. We were like, well, hey, remember those comments you made in that podcast? He's like, I still believe it to this day. The nice part is I'm actually going to be getting cheered on this time versus getting booed.
That's going to be awesome. And I don't know if we went over the strengths and weaknesses to look out for, but I have a feeling the passing game could get a little higher. But what's your take on the strengths and weaknesses to look out for this season?
So let's start off with the offense. I think the offensive line is going to be very, very good for BYU. They actually brought in, I think, 4 or 5 transfers along an offensive line that, frankly, was actually pretty good last year. But the guys they brought in, I think, are guys that are capable of starting. So they should have a very good offensive unit. I think they could go as deep as 9 or 10 deep, honestly, on that offensive line. And that should bode well for their ability to hold up in the trenches against opposing defenses. Now, the question marks remain in the backfield, quarterback and running back in particular for BYU. But to your point, Jackson, the passing game, the wide receivers they have, as well as Isaac Rex at tight end, they should, in theory, have plenty of options for Keaton Slovis to throw the ball to. You got a nice trio of returning receivers in Keanu Hill, Cody Epps, as well as Chase Roberts. They also added 2 transfer portal guys, Darius Lassiter from Eastern Michigan, as well as Keelan Marion from UConn, who I think make a nice 5-man rotation at wide receiver. And I already mentioned Isaac Rex. This is a guy during the 2020 season set a BYU freshman record with 12 touchdown receptions, played last year maybe 70% because he had a compound dislocation of his ankle at the tail end of the 2021 season in a win at USC. Played all last season with a bunch of hardware in that ankle. We're talking pins and screws and plates and all that type of stuff. Had surgery to take all that out this past offseason, and during spring camp, he looked markedly more agile and able to run more freely. So I think he's going to return to more of the form we saw of him in 2020 and 2021 versus last season in 2022. So yeah, I think that the passing game on paper should be quite strong for BYU. The running game, I think, is a little bit of a question just because you have your top 2 running backs in theory are both transfers coming in. I mentioned Aiden Robbins earlier, a transfer from UNLV, and then Deion Smith, one of the many, I'll call him cast-offs. I don't mean that in a bad way, but one of the many guys that Deion Sanders let go at Colorado. He comes to BYU and is a nice kind of counter or a nice counterpart to like Aiden Robbins. It's the thunder and lightning analogy. You know this, Jackson. You remember Reggie Bush and Lendell White. Remember Reggie was the lightning, Lendell White was the power. Well, that's more of what Deion Smith and you have with Aiden Robbins. Aiden Robbins is more of that power back just because he's a bigger body. Well, where Deion Smith, a little more agile and a smaller running back, so they should be able to pair together well there. Now let's flip over to the defense. The defensive line was frankly not good last year, and they brought in a number of transfers to hopefully shore that up. Jackson Cravens was a 3-year starter at Boise State, actually a guy who was a native of Provo, Utah, but played at Boise State for most of his career. He's back for 1 year and hoping to do some big things for the Cougars. They also brought his teammate Isaiah Banya to bring some pass rush to BYU's defensive line, which was a huge issue. It's been an issue for 4 or 5 years, is the inability to really get high sack numbers. I think last year they had 15 sacks the entire season. And going into the bowl game, I think they had 11. So they got 4 of those in the bowl game, if I recall correctly. So they need to get more pass rush and be able to disrupt opposing quarterbacks, especially in the Big 12, where you have some pretty high-level quarterbacks you're going up against. Now, the strength of the defense, I think, is in that linebacking core. I already mentioned Max Tooley and Ben Bywater, both of them very good linebackers. And AJ Vongpachon, who's the transfer from Utah State. He is a guy who is an absolute rock in the middle of that Aggie defense, which was very stingy, I thought, a year ago by and large. And he should bolster that back 3 for BYU along the front 7. And if he lives up to what he's capable of doing, I think suddenly BYU's front 7 looks a lot better than it did a year ago, and that could become a strength. I would say on paper, the strength for BYU going into the season is easily in the secondary. Two or three high-level safeties, a nice cornerback coming back, as well as adding a transfer in Eddie Heckard, who is an FCS All-American at Weber State. On paper, I think the secondary is the strength, but I think there are tools on that defense to make the front 7 much better than it was a year ago. And if not, BYU could struggle mightily once again.
Well, that is something to look out for. I'm so excited about that dynamic duo at linebacker. That's going to be amazing. Jeffrey from Only Talk Sports says, great interview so far, guys. Thank you so much for watching and commenting, Jeffrey from Only Talk Sports. This guy is one of the best in the nation.
Well, it's fun to be on. That's the thing about this. I love what I do, and I know that you just launched this podcast, and you reached out and said, hey, would you be willing to come on? Always happy to do it. That's my favorite thing about this. I love people who take the initiative to build their own products and kind of get into the content creation realm. I'm always happy to help people out. So I appreciate you even reaching out and thinking of me to come on and talk about BYU.
Well, you're one of the best. I'm happy to have you on. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at all the teams in the Big 12.
Yeah.
Now, I know BYU's got some history with TCU. Oh, man. I mean, like College Game Day went to BYU TCU in 2009. Like, that was pretty awesome. And I know BYU's got a little bit of a rivalry with, I want to say they got a little bit of a rivalry with the Baylor Bear Necessities. But,
A little bit.
but out of all these teams in the Big 12, and Texas Oklahoma are going to leave after 2023, which team is the most likely to be the Big 12 rival for BYU?
That's a great question, and I think most people would point to TCU because of their history both in the WAC and the Mountain West together. As you mentioned, the last time College Game Day was in Provo was for a game against TCU in 2009. I do think that it's easy to think of the Horned Frogs and the Cougars kind of renewing that rivalry there, and I think that it will be a rivalry once again. But I've got this suspicion, Jackson, that Baylor and BYU, just because they're both private religious institutions, are going to be pretty good rivals in this conference. They already played 2 high-level games in 2021 and 2022, both of them winning on their home turf against one another. Baylor beating BYU down in Waco in 21, and then BYU getting revenge last season in 2022 in Provo. It showed some high-level football. The best part was the fan bases seemed to get along pretty well, but had some good-natured ribbing between them. I just think because of the religious affiliation between the two of those, I know that TCU has got the Texas Christian moniker as well, which lends itself to it as well. But I think that the Baylor BYU matchup in time could become a fantastic rivalry matchup if it's given the opportunity to become such.
Oh man, it's gonna be fun watching BYU TCU as a conference game again.
Oh yeah.
Although like the last time they played each other was in 2011 in the Jerry Dome in BYU's first year as an independent, and TCU's last year as a Mount West team. They were originally planning to join the Big East, but then the Big 12 was calling. They're like, we're going to the Big 12.
Yeah, I remember that game down there in Jerry World. It's actually got a famous clip. If you go and watch that, there's highlights of that game. You can find them on YouTube. Riley Nelson was the quarterback for BYU at the time. He scored a touchdown late in that game, and the referee was taking his time to make the call on the guy on the goal line, and he puts his hands up, and Riley Nelson celebrating, jumps up and high-fived the referee. You can go find it. It's out on YouTube. It's all over the place. It's also if you want a GIF generator, you can just search BYU and it'll pop up as well. But it's one of the more kind of famous clips in BYU history of him just running up and high-fiving a referee who's signaling touchdown.
Oh, man, that's pretty awesome. And I remember that year in BYU's first year, they started off with Ole Miss. It was in Oxford on ESPN. That was a great game, you know.
Yeah, well, and that was the first game in BYU's independent history, playing down there in the Grove. Kyle Van Noy, who would become just he's one of the all-time legends of BYU linebackers, single-handedly won that game as he scored a touchdown. He strip sack, landed on the end zone for a touchdown to get BYU out of there with the victory, and that was a big win for BYU looking back on it. They got Independence off on the right note. There were a number of BYU fans who traveled to Ole Miss to take in the scenes down there in the Grove, the tailgate scene, obviously, which is world famous. But it got Independence off on the right note. Did they have some other high watermarks along the way in Independence? Yes, but it's always good to start off your independent era with a win over an SEC team.
Oh, for sure, man. That is for sure. Even though Ole Miss was a disaster that year, it's great all the same.
Well, hey, that's the thing about this. Yeah, they weren't, if you look back, they weren't great, but here's the thing. BYU doesn't play SEC teams all that often. Honestly, you look at their history, they've not played a lot of them. But whenever they can play them, and especially if they can get a win, it means a lot to BYU to get wins like that.
Yeah, I believe they played the Alabama Crimson Tide the last time in 1998, I believe. I was a year old then, but
Sean Alexander, man. You remember Sean Alexander, I would assume. Absolutely ran roughshod over BYU in that game. It wasn't pretty. Let's put it that way. I know a number of Cougar fans, actually know some former BYU players who were on that team. They said that they just could not stop him. He was unstoppable that day. And they made life pretty miserable for BYU down there at Bryant-Denny.
Oh man, it was wow. But the little 2018 game against Wisconsin, the little sweatshirt that I got on, that upset where BYU basically showed a Wisconsin nation and that they were a little bit overrated, unfortunately.
Well, and okay, here's the thing about that game in particular is there weren't many games. I've been covering BYU professionally. Like my professional experience as a media member pretty much coincides with BYU going independent. 2011 was the first full year I covered BYU on a full-time basis as a credentialed media member. So I've covered them all through independence, but that Wisconsin game in particular, considering the circumstances around that game, BYU going into it, Wisconsin was ranked 6th, if I recall correctly, going into that game. There are not many games in independence that I remember thinking, you know what, BYU doesn't have much of a chance in this game. But that was one of those ones I was like, I'm not sure they can really do this. They're going to go in there and get their heads kicked in, because the year before, if you look at it, Wisconsin came to Provo and their quarterback, I don't know if it was Hornibrook or something like that. He was like,
Alex Hornibrook.
Yeah, he was 21 of 23 passing in that game, just absolutely carved BYU up in Provo. So I didn't have much faith in BYU's opportunity to go into Camp Randall there and win that game, but they stunned Wisconsin. Absolutely thrilling win. There's an incredible trick play in that game. It was a wide receiver option pass. So quarterback Tanner Mangum at the time threw it to a kid named Aleva Hifo, and then the tight end Moroni Laulu Pututau just broke down the middle of the field with not a single defender around him. So Aleva just uncorks a deep pass. It was like 30 yards for a touchdown. It's a play that BYU fans will always remember because of that game. And obviously when you get a win like that, it's going to stick in BYU fans' memories. And it was a big win because it really signaled, hey, you know what? This BYU team can do something. Because in 2017, BYU was just so bad. They were 4-9. They'd been really, really down on their luck. And that signaled, you know what? Maybe this program isn't as bad as they were a year ago. Maybe they're going to show some signs of life. And a win like that obviously put a lot of wind in their sails.
So you just talked about how you've been like covering BYU since like 2011. What were your favorite moments? Like I'm kind of having a feeling like 2015 Nebraska and Boise State has to be up there. Yep. And BYU ending that losing streak against Utah in 2021. I mean, that's got to be an awesome moment right there.
Well, that might be the greatest weekend in BYU independence history, because you think about this. September 10th, 2021, BYU gets the official invite to the Big 12 Conference, accepts it, has the press conference, a lot of celebration on that front. But then the very next day, they play against Utah, and as you mentioned, they snapped that streak. They had not beaten them since 2009. It had been 12 years, 9 games straight. They had lost to Utah. They didn't want to make it 10 straight, and they get the win. And if you watch the highlights of that game, you can just watch the scenes unfold on the field after that game. BYU fans, you would have thought they won the Super Bowl. Honestly, it had been so long. It had been over a decade since they had beat their arch rivals, and they were ecstatic. And obviously that coinciding with the day before officially getting the call up to the Power 5 ranks. Quite frankly, that might be the best weekend in BYU history in quite some time, maybe outside that 1984 national title. But the thing about this is you also mentioned the Nebraska game. I was there at Nebraska on that Hail Mary. I actually went as I went to that game actually as a fan. I have a very good friend from my college days who was a Nebraska fan. So I went with him to that game, and I was watching it from the stands. And the way we were sitting in the stands in that end zone where Mitch Matthews caught the touchdown pass, the Hail Mary to win it. But where we were situated, we were on the other side of the end zone. There was a wall. There's a brick wall there at Nebraska. I couldn't see what was happening. And there was a BYU fan about, I'd say probably 10 rows in front of me, who all of a sudden starts just jumping up and down and screaming. I'm like, what happened? He turns around. He caught it. I'm like, what?
Oh, man. I remember Sean McDonald. He was like, caught! Touchdown! BYU! Mitch Matthews!
That's an incredible Sean McDonough impression. Well done,
man.
sir.
Thank you.
I
sometimes do voice impressions from time to time.
That was a good Sean McDonough. I'll give you credit on that. That was awesome. But that's the thing about that is that was one of those moments you'll never forget if you're a BYU fan. Whether you're watching it on TV, if you're lucky enough like I was to be there in Nebraska, there in Lincoln, watching it happen live. It's just there are moments throughout, and you can talk about this. You know, you're a college fan as well. Any program has those moments you'll never forget, and those are some of the moments that BYU fans won't soon forget. And that's the best part about it. That's a great comment right there. Yes, only talk sports. Jackson is a great voice impersonator. He is, because that was a great Sean McDonough. So that's the thing about this is it's a ton of fun to look back on these. And I've been doing this all off season long with my podcast. Is I've been going through. BYU played 155 games as an independent football program. I started with that Ole Miss game way back in January, and we've been kind of grinding our way through it all off season long. And the hope is that we'll get done by the time BYU kicks off in September against Sam Houston State there in Provo, and we'll have recapped every single one of those games. And the fun part is to think back on some of those games and my having covered all of them during that time. It's a lot of fun to think back and think of what happened, the circumstances, and what they entailed in the end.
Oh man, it is awesome. So I want to ask you, is it way too early to give a preseason prediction, or you want to wait like a few weeks on that, or
you talk about
what's your overall record prediction for BYU this year?
Anybody who's listened to my podcast, I'm kind of a broken record with this, but I think that 6-6 is where I'm setting the benchmark for success for BYU year one in the Big 12. I think that if they can handle their business at home, they've got 2 home games out of the gate against Sam Houston State as well as Southern Utah. You should be 2-0 before you really hit the meat and potatoes portion of your schedule, which will feature 10 straight Power 5 games. But that means you got to pick off 4 other wins in there. And I think there are the likes of West Virginia. They were picked dead last in the media poll. That came out. We're recording this on a Thursday, so that came out today. I think that Neil Brown, by the time BYU goes to West Virginia in early November, he could already be fired. So they could be in flux there, and you could pick up a win there. I already said I think BYU can beat Oklahoma at home, so that's 4 wins right there. Then they've got the likes of Cincinnati coming in as their home opener in Big 12 play in late September. I think that Scott Satterfield has got a lot of work to do to get Cincinnati back to what they were under Luke Fickell. So I think you can pick up a win there. So I can see a really a way to get to 6-6, and you do anything beyond that, you're bowl eligible. I think that's a good debut for BYU. So yeah, my prediction 6-6. Anything beyond that's gravy.
There we go. I'm excited to see the little BYU Kansas game. That's going to be a great. I mean, the first Big 12 conference game on the road, but the first Big 12 home conference game the day before my birthday. That's going to be fantastic. Like, I'll be flipping between that game and Utah, Oregon State, and I believe North Carolina State, Louisville. I believe it.
There's some pretty decent games that day, and that's the thing. I'm actually going to make the trip. I'm going to Lawrence. I figured, you know what, this is a once in a lifetime deal. BYU's first Power 5 game is first, I guess, conference game as a Power 5 member, as a member of the Big 12. I was like, you know what, I can't miss that. So I'm actually making the trip to Lawrence. I'm very excited for that. I'm actually going to be at Big 12 Media Days next week down there in Arlington, Texas. So a lot of fun times ahead for BYU year one. There's so much new with this for BYU that it's going to be a really fun year, just kind of the novelty of it all.
Oh man, I'm so excited about the media days because I mean, like, I know there's going to be a lot of boredom with no baseball for a little bit. There's going to be home run derby. I mean, let's be honest, the home run derby is not the same without Chris Berman calling it. I mean, there we go, back, gone. He could go all the way, 99 yards.
Yeah, there you go, nicely done.
Well, that's why they play the games.
But to your point, it's actually, I think it's very strategically placed because you remember the Midsummer Classic is Tuesday night. Guess what happens Wednesday morning or is it Wednesday afternoon? Big 12 Media Day. And there's no baseball, as you mentioned. I think Brett Yormark, Big 12's commissioner, saw that and said, you know what we're going to do? Yeah, it's a little bit early in July to be doing that. But guess what everybody's going to be talking about with no baseball? Us. It's actually a really advantageous spot for the Big 12 to be in.
Oh, there we go. So I heard that Brett Yormark's talking about how he wants to get to 14 for the Big 12. Mm-hmm. Who are the 2 likely candidates to join if that were to happen?
Yeah, so he made the comment that he wants to stick at 14 after Texas and Oklahoma leave. And now that obviously led to all kinds of speculation, as you might imagine. I think the two most likely, if it does come to fruition, I think it's Colorado and Arizona from the Pac-12. They seem to be the two most likely that are considering making a jump. I think at the same time, if Brett Yormark wants to, he could go out and snipe a program like San Diego State right out from underneath the nose of the Pac-12 because of all their conversations about wanting to join the Pac-12, and they now find themselves on the outs with the Mountain West Conference. That's a whole nother story that we could do a whole podcast on in and of itself. But so I think that they are going to look around. He talks about it always wanting it to be additive. He wants a program that's going to bring eyeballs, obviously bring extra money to the conference. So if you go by that metric, I think you're probably looking at rating the Pac-12 and picking off at least Colorado and maybe Arizona, and who knows beyond that. But if you ask me, the two that I think that they're targeting, if you gave them truth serum, I think it's the Buffaloes and the Wildcats.
There we go. Austin Williams has got he has a question for you. He wants to know what you think of TCU for the upcoming season.
I'm actually quite high on TCU. I picked them in my media poll. I had them 5th. So obviously they made their run to the national title game a year ago. The defense is awesome for TCU. I think they're going to be very, very good defensively. The big question mark is, we all know this, Max Duggan, Keontae Johnson, like the number of guys they lost from that offense, from that run to the national title game, that's where things are going to hurt, I think, a little bit for TCU. But the nice part is they got Chandler Morris back at quarterback. I think a lot of people forget that he was the starter game 1 against Colorado ahead of Max Duggan. Obviously, when Duggan got his opportunity, he never relinquished the job. But I think there is a big, big opportunity for TCU this year to play dark horse this year. Like I said, I picked them 5th. I felt like that was probably a good spot to have them because, like I said, they're going to retool that offense a little bit. But that defense in and of itself, I think it's capable of keeping them in any single game that they're in, because they brought back the vast majority, if not all, of their major contributors on that defense. And that's a major leg up in a conference that is as offensive dominant as the Big 12 can be.
There we go. It's going to be amazing to see what TCU can bring in 2023, although they may not be the national runner-up this year.
Yeah, probably not. But, hey, that was a fun run all the same. I was all in on the Hypnotoad movement last year, I'll say that.
Oh, for sure, man. And, it's going to be really fantastic. I kind of want to let me see. It's just going to be amazing to see what 2023 brings.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be awesome. So before we leave, for those who don't know about you and they want to talk a little bit about BYU, or they want to discuss some questions for you for the Big 12, where can they find you?
Well, I'm all over social media. Threads just launched, so I just added all of my social media out there. You can follow me. Jacob C. Hatch is my Twitter handle. It's also my same handle on Threads, the new Twitter alternative out there. If you want my podcast feeds, you can just search out Locked On Cougars on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. It's also available wherever you get your podcasts. We're streaming this live on YouTube. Locked On Cougars is also on YouTube as well. So check it out, subscribe. The nice part is we do podcasts every single day. The goal with them simply is to make it so you can do it in one sitting. The average American commute, we learned at the network I work for, they did the math on this. The average American commute is 22 minutes. So we kind of target our podcast to be in that 20 to 30 minute range. So that way, if you're commuting to work or you're doing a workout, that type of stuff, you can have the podcast done and you're off to the next thing. You're not having to come back and listen to it in multiple chunks to get caught up on the news of the day. So it's a lot of fun, but we're available wherever you get your podcast. Like I said, it's also on YouTube with a video element.
Oh man, before we go, any voice impressions you can do?
I am awful at voice impressions, honestly, and it's something I probably should work on. But my wife is very fond of making fun of me because I'm actually really bad with pop culture references as well, like movie references. She'll quote something. I'll kind of give her like this deadpan look of like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "You don't know that movie?" And I've probably seen the movie. I'm just awful with pop culture references. I guess it's too big of a sports nerd in me to be that up to speed on my street smarts.
Well, I'm doing my best on the pop culture stuff as well, where it's just kind of like 10 years ago, somebody asked me, you know this movie? I'm like, no. Do you know like this time that's going on this channel? No, I'm watching Sports Center.
You and me both. That's my preferred channel is to watch Sports Center, man. That's what it's exactly.
Oh man. Although they're gonna have some big setbacks though.
Oh yeah, but that's the thing about that is it's kind of sad to see. Excuse me, it's sad to see a bunch of these big name media pundits from ESPN getting laid off. Like Gene Wojciechowski, man, he's part of the college football universe there at ESPN. He's been there for 2.5. Well, he had been there for 2.5 decades. Like it's crazy to think of those people losing their jobs, but the hope is that they'll land on their feet somewhere and continue to do good things out there in the media sphere. But yeah, ESPN's going to change. There's no doubt about that. There are changes coming for that network.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I got a feeling College Game Day is not going to be the same.
Well, yeah, you lose David Pollack, you lose Wojciechowski. Like, man, you're losing some really big personalities on that show. And of course, you'll have Corso, you'll have Herb Street, you'll have Desmond Howard. You're going to have those guys still there. But losing guys like Pollack and Wojciechowski, it takes away from that. And by the way, I'll just add this. If Big Noon Kickoff, obviously Fox's equivalent of College Game Day is smart, you'd go grab David Pollack, you go grab Gene Wojciechowski and add them to the Bear. They already have Chris Felica over there with them. You go add those guys to your thing and make yourselves the preeminent power in those Saturday morning shows.
It's looking that way at this point because I mean, as of today, I saw that Mark Ingram is added to the Big Noon Kickoff. That's going to be pretty amazing. Although I'm kind of like, maybe David Pollack could start his own thing.
Well, sure. And that's the thing about that. I'm sure he's considering all options at this point, but that's the nice part about this. You know, this, you're doing a podcast on, you and I do a podcast. Like if you want to do things, you can create your own little media empire. It takes obviously a lot of effort to do it, but you're capable of doing that. And a guy that like David Pollack, who's got that big of a following, he absolutely could leverage that into something to support himself if he wanted to.
Oh yeah. As much as he should. Yeah. And, you know, I guess we got all our, final thoughts out the way, and for those who are just watching this show, you can check out Jacob Hatch on Instagram, check out Locked On Cougars on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, Apple, Linktree, wherever you find your friendly neighborhood podcast. And the KSL Sports Zone is on Twitter, and you can find Jacob Hatch on the newly made app Threads, the competitor to Twitter. And of course, you can find Jacob Hatch on Twitter. And thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing to this channel, Jackson Johnson. Like, comment, subscribe, or give me a follow, thumbs up, and I'll be seeing you later.